In this section, we'll discuss the use of modular code. As you write macros and as your macros become more complex, you'll find that they have more and more lines of code. And rather than having a single sub-procedure with hundreds or even thousands of lines of code, it's far better to subdivide your code into separate modules. And there are two types of modules, sub-procedures and functions, which we'll discuss in this section. Let's begin by talking about sub-procedures. So in our training folder, let's go into 04, Procedures and Functions, and open up 01, Sub-procedures and Module Level Variables. Then let's go into the Visual Basic Editor, and you'll see that we've got a single module which contains one of the macros that we wrote earlier. Now if this macro were more complex, what we would typically do is to have each of these sections as a separate sub-procedure. And that's what we'll be doing in this video, just to get some practice on how to work with separate sub-procedures. So the first thing we'll address is the question of variable scope. And this basically means from where, within your code, a variable's contents can be accessed. At the moment, all of our variables are contained within this sub-procedure, this macro called copy data. So their scope is currently local, in other words, local to this specific sub-procedure. If there are any other sub-procedures within this module, they wouldn't have access to any of these variables. So the first thing we want to do is to take all of these variables and change their scope to module level. And that's very easy to do. It's simply a question of position. If they're positioned inside a sub-procedure, they're local to that sub-procedure. If they're positioned outside all sub-procedures, that will make them module level. So I can simply cut them and then paste them here. Simply by moving them into this position means that if I have several sub-procedures within this module, all of them will have access to exactly the same variables. Although position is the only essential requirement for declaring a module level variable, it's also best practice to use the keyword private as opposed to dim. Dim is perfectly legal, it works fine, but by using the keyword private, you're emphasizing that these variables have a scope which is module wide. So I'm just going to use find and replace. I highlight the variables, Control H, replace, and I'm replacing the keyword dim with the keyword private, and replace all within the selected text. We can also use the private keyword when declaring constants. Naturally, the word private can't replace const, so it's used in addition. So we would simply have private const as opposed to simply const. Another convention worth following is to indicate the scope of the variable within your naming convention. And typically what you would do is to precede all module level variables with the letter M. So MWKB source, for example. So I'm just going to use find and replace to achieve that. Let's start by having WK replaced with MWK. And I'm going to make sure I switch on match case for this. I don't think that's going to mess anything up. So replace all. So that takes care of workbooks and worksheets. Then we have RNG. So RNG becomes MRNG. Replace all. And finally we have strings. And this time it is very important that we have the match case switched on, because obviously we've got words like strings, and here again we've got the parameter name string, which we wouldn't want changed. So match case will take care of that, and replace all. So now all our variables which have the module level scope are now prefixed with the letter M. And at this point it's definitely worth testing to see whether our code still works. So yes, it does, so we haven't broken anything. Let's just close that workbook. Let's now turn to our sub-procedures. So we'll say that this current sub-procedure, the macro itself, will be the main sub-procedure from which we'll call all of the others. So I'm just going to change the name to main, and then the first sub-procedure that we'll modularize will be this section. So I'm going to cut this and just paste it as a separate sub-procedure. So I can obviously type it, but I'm just going to use insert procedure. And the way to distinguish between a macro sub-procedure and a sub-procedure which is called from within a macro is the scope. So it becomes private. And I'm going to call this one user input, and then paste the code that I copied. Having placed this code in a separate sub-procedure, it's then important that I call it from the main sub-procedure. So let's just get the name, and here I can insert a call statement. If I simply paste the name, that's sufficient to cause the sub-procedure to run. But for clarity, it's useful to put in the keyword call, just to emphasize that you are calling a separate sub-procedure on that line. Then let's do the same with this second section, open source workbook. So again, I'll cut all the code, create a new private sub-procedure, and I'll call this open source WKB, and paste in the copied code. Then we need to call this new sub-procedure, and paste. Then let's have just two more sections. So all of this can be our processing. We'll call this process data. Again, we have a private sub-procedure, process data, and we paste in all of that code. I'll just tab this in to make it a bit more readable, and let's do the same here. And indeed here. So this is called process data, and then finally let's have finalization. And let's call finalization. So that completes our modularization, and although it's slightly overkill because obviously this is quite a short piece of code, it hopefully just gives you a taste of how you structure a typical application. So as you add more functionality, you have basically separate blocks of code, separate sub-procedures for each section of that functionality. Another thing you may find useful is just to change the mode to procedure view. And this basically means that you just work on one procedure at a time. And in the top right here, from the procedure drop down, you can switch between the different procedures. I'll just go back to full module view, and of course I should just test that it still works. So this is now the only macro that we have within this module. Just to prove that, if we go back to Excel, click on macros, you'll see that only main is listed. All of the private sub-procedures aren't treated as macros. So let's just run main, do this time, and we still get the same result.